programming if something doesn't break.
Oh, 100%. And here we go. We out here. All right, y'all. So like I mentioned, today I wanted to chat about extending the conversation about React, just introduce us to a little bit more concepts there. First, we'll review some of the stuff we've done before, just to level set, make sure we're all on the same page. Then we'll introduce a new topic in React. Today, we're talking about props, and props are a major part of programming in React and leveraging JavaScript to pass data from one component to another component. So we'll talk about that. And later, we'll get into some more interesting features of using JavaScript when programming and language-based things in JavaScript as it relates to using arrays, which, as we all might know, arrays are a data structure, a collection that helps us keep a list of different data in an ordered way. And we can use arrays in very unique ways when it comes to creating more components or JSX with React. So we'll talk about that and go over a little bit more of what you can do with arrays in JavaScript. So that's the plan. And to get into that, I will start by sharing my screen and just pulling up the last application we worked on and just do a little code review real quick. So don't mind me as I look for that on the Zoom. So this is our nice little application. It was a pretty simple flip of the default React, create React app template. We started off creating a new project. That project I have here in VS Code. And all we did was make some modifications to the app.js, right? So as a recap of what we've done so far, we created a new React application. Again, in order to do that, we used the Create React App toolchain, which looks something like this, right? So npx create React App, and then the name of the project that you want to create. And that will run through a series of scripts that will build your project for you, right? Create your first project. It will create all the default files. It will, even if everything is installed right on your computer, create that first Git commit for you. And I know some folks were having some trouble with that, but Create React App toolchain typically does a lot of that work for you to allow for you to just start your project off in a unique way. The app.js we talked about a couple times. The app.js represents the file for the first component in your React application, the first component that Create React App builds for us. And that component, right, we talked a little bit about it last session. That component is nothing more than just a function returning some JSX. JSX is a JavaScript syntax that looks like the HTML that we're used to, but it is JavaScript that basically turns those visual elements into HTML while rendering, when the JavaScript renders through the React library. So we use JSX to create all the visual elements that we will want to see on our website, much like we would use HTML to create all those visual elements. Now we do all of that with JSX in React. And a component is just a function whose responsibility is to return some JSX to our application, right? And the app.js is our first component. It's an important component in Create React App templated applications, because that component is the component, that component is the component that eventually gets rendered on our screen through the React library here, as you can see in the index.js. So the way that Create React App template works is that it creates a link to our HTML and it renders a component to the screen, and we start writing our code inside of that component to have our visual elements show up. So we never really touched the index.js at the beginning of the project unless there are certain other wrapping libraries or wrapping components we want to put over the app. But for the most part, those are more intermediate libraries that you might not need to know about immediately right now. But the app.js, for lack of better words, is the most important component so long as you're just getting started with React. That component, again, is just nothing more than just a function, right? So we can like we've done here, just minimize it so you can see, hey, function syntax, and all it's doing is returning some JSX. A little bit more of what we got into last session, we talked about how JSX is a combination of different elements that are going to be rendered on the screen, right? Those elements can contain HTML-like things like divs, headings, paragraphs, anchors, the regular HTML elements we might be used to, but in JSX can also represent other components. And what we see here in the app.js is the JSX for rendering another component, right? And so that component, if you look at the line 26 here, is the hello component, which is the second component we built after starting this project. That component is stored in its own file, which we have saved in a new folder we created called components. And inside of that folder, you can see that we have that hello.js. All React component files will have the .js syntax because these are JavaScript files, and we want the program text editor to know that this is JavaScript and we're calling JavaScript in those files, right? So taking a look at the hello.js, we can see more of the JSX for the typical visual elements that you might be used to, right, in HTML. So we got the div, we got the H3, we got some paragraphs in there, and all of those are the things that are coming back up on our application like so. So all these visual elements, what's unique about them right now is that we were rendering them from their own component, which again is nothing more than just a function returning some JSX. And what's unique about this is the fact that it's in its own file, and we were able to export it so that we could import it inside of the app.js as a component that we could use. This is a typical process for how we will work with React to create our visual elements for any website. Is break down the website to different components that we might want to represent visually and say, okay, I'm going to build the component that's going to do this, build a component that's going to do that, and eventually import them when they need to be so they can be rendered through the component hierarchy. And clearly the app is the most root level hierarchy of the most root level component, in the hierarchy, and rendering anything that we want to see. Because of the fact that the app is going to be the first component rendered, means that if we want something to be rendered outside of, if we want something to be rendered, we need it to be inside of the app, if that makes sense. So that's a little bit about what we got into last session. We built this hello component, and right now it is doing a great job putting some text into our file so we can see it here when we run the code. And the unique thing now to talk about is just adding an extension to how can we make this component a little bit more sophisticated? How can we make this component a little bit more flexible? Because one thing that is really dope about React is just using components more flexibly. So rather than just have one component for each thing, if I can have a component that can be used and extended in multiple ways, that saves me a lot of time in coding because I don't have to recreate multiple files. I can use the same component to basically make something a little bit more eloquent, right? A little bit more thoughtful. So to talk about that, I want to introduce a new concept in React that we haven't covered yet, unless you've been taking a look at some of the other videos or getting into React on your own. And that concept is called props. So I'm just going to go over to the React documentation real quick, go to the docs and show you where you could look for information about props. If you scroll down here in main concepts, we've talked about some of these things, right? Introducing JSX, we were just talking about that. Rendering elements is exactly what we talked about functions are responsible for. Components are the building block of our application, and storing that JSX in different files allows us to create new components that we can then use as representatives of the code that they're going to render, right? And now we're going to talk about props. So you can see it here on section 4 in the React documentation. It's all about components and props. And so we are going to do that. They are giving us a nice shout out to try out the new React documentation. And I'm just going to open in another tab to just kind of see what's going on in there. But just wanted to show you a little bit more about what's going on in where you can find some information and insight on this as well. So so props are essentially a way for us to pass data from one component to another component. And there's multiple reasons why we might do that. One reason we might do that is because that other component requires some data that it doesn't have access to, right? And in order to pass the data, in order for that component to render, we need to pass some data to it. So if a component is expecting some data and it doesn't necessarily have it, we might need to pass props to that component so that it can have access to that data. Another reason why you might pass props from one component to another is if you are trying to establish a better relationship between the parent component and the child component. And we'll see a little bit about that in a couple of minutes when we get into some examples. But props is a way for us to send data from one component down to another component. And in many ways, from one component up to another component as well. So let's take a look at this application that we started already, right? We have this nice, beautiful hello message that's kind of printing some paragraphs underneath it, right? Taking a look at it in the code, as you can see, have this one component called hello, and it is got a couple different paragraphs inside of it that are rendering right now, right? So just to show you kind of how components work, right? What makes a component dope is the fact that if I want to duplicate this code, like let's say I want 2 hellos, right? Instead of just one. Well, instead of having to go ahead and type all of this div with the H3 and 3 paragraphs over again, right? I can just call that component twice, right? So if I do something like this and extend the app a little bit, and let's say I want 2 hello components, right? I could do something like this, right? Where I create multiple hello components. The parser is getting mad at me because one thing that comes up when you are trying to render multiple elements on one thing that comes up when you're trying to render multiple elements, period, is you need some wrapping container for those elements. And you might be curious, like, what is a container? Well, a container in this case would just be any HTML that is able to hold other elements as children, right? So we need to render one element that at least will hold a list of other elements. So in this case, right, one thing that you see commonly done is either people use what's called a fragment or people just use a div. And so let's show you for a div, right? So if I wanted to just kind of make this compiler not so mad, instead of just trying to render each of these without a wrapping component, and I'll show you real quick before I do this, what the little warning is showing. If I hover over it, right, it says JSX expressions must have at least one parent element. So when you see something like that, that just means that your code, your JSX here, isn't necessarily showing which component is enclosing those other components. You need some component that is going to hold those ones. And so again, a div is a great choice because, like we talked about with HTML, divs are a type of element that normally nests other elements. And so you can see something like this will work, right? Like now this div is the parent element of all of these different components. And so typically you might see people do this. The other thing you might see are people using what's called a fragment, which looks something like this. I personally use a lot of divs when I'm making my container elements, but either you can use this fragment that looks something like an empty tag like this in order to just create a wrapping parent element. One unique thing about using a div, though, is if you do, you can style it, right? You can add class names and all whatnot and style it as you might want to. So I'm going to keep it in a div for now, just to show you kind of how I would do this. But now we have multiple elements rendering, right? They're all the same component, though, so we don't have to reuse that. We don't have to duplicate that code. We can just use this component to represent that code, right? So if I save this now, and after it finishes saving, go back to our running server to see some of these changes live. Once it finishes loading and saving, we should see all of those new messages pop up just like they just did, right? So using components is great because now whenever I want something like this to show itself, I can make it happen with one line of code versus having to duplicate all of those lines of code. So components become this really cool, almost like Legos, right? That you can then use that same piece in different places when you need it. And that is really dope, because when you have components that are reusable, you can save your time coding, so you don't have to recreate the wheel every time you want something to show up. So let's say instead of this hello, right, this general kind of component we made when we were first testing, let's change this component a little bit and make it more of like a message, right? Let's maybe make it so that it says hello and then somebody's name, right? So maybe in this case, right, because I am Cam and y'all know me, I'll be like hello, and then I'll put Cam, right? So if I save this, right, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to say hello, Cam, a bunch of times, right? So what would be a good solution here, right? If I wanted to have particularly, a couple different messages, right? Maybe I want 4 different messages, but instead of it only saying Cam each time, how can I make it so that this hello component almost can find out who it should say hello to, right? This is one of those use cases for when you will use props. It's in moments like this where you're saying, hey, I have this component and I might be calling that same component over and over again, but I need that component to have different data at different moments in time, right? Or different data when it's rendering more than anything, right? So what we can do is use props in order to solve this problem, right? So props in React are actually really simple, and they're so simple that I think sometimes it's like, oh, how do I use props? I forgot, but it's a pretty simple process. First thing you need to do is define the prop, and prop, really you can define it to be whatever you want in terms of its name to name it, right? So for now, let's say like each component, let's say hypothetically, each of these components will have maybe a piece of data that represents the name of the person they want to say hello to. So maybe hypothetically, instead of this saying Cam, maybe there's some way for us to have like some variable called like name or something, right? And name, might be some JavaScript, right? And we might want that data to just kind of show itself, right? And just make itself known to us here, right? Well, turns out with props, we can make something like this happen very easily, right? So if I know in my component, I'm expecting some kind of data, I can just pass that data into the component when it's being rendered, right? So how you pass props is you find the component as it's being rendered, right? Where it's being called in a return statement somewhere. And you say, okay, I want this component to have some data. That data, I'm just going to call it name. I'm saying, okay, name. This component is going to have a data called name. And I'm going to set that data equal to some JavaScript, so some either a string, integer, Boolean, whatever I want to set it equal to. The syntax for setting it to some JavaScript is always going to be passing it with some curly braces, right? Just keep this in mind when you're working with it. There's certain moments where you might see people not do it, but I think it's a great best practice to just always wrap it with some curly braces so you can remember, hey, I'm passing some JavaScript here, right? So name, I don't necessarily need the equal sign on next to it like this, so I could do something like this. And I could say, okay, so this component hello is going to have some data called name, right? And that data is going to be maybe a new string called Cam, right? Or for the sake of our test here, right? Maybe I'll go ahead and put my whole government in there so folks know that is different data, right? So now, right, this component hello has some data, a prop called name that's getting passed when it's being rendered. And what's dope about this is now inside of that hello component, I can make use of the props in order to access that data and use that data in this component. And the way I need to do that is I need to essentially have props as an argument in my function. So whether you use an arrow function or you use the default, kind of function like this, right? You still would pass props similarly like this, right? So props coming into the function, and then you can make use of that data, right? But for the sake of this arrow function, right, I have props. And every component has props as a list of different, as an object, essentially, of different key value pairs of data, right? So hello right now has a prop inside of this piece of data called name, right? So if I want to access it, I'm just going to say props.name, right? And props.name is going to refer to the data that was passed into this component as a prop called name. I know that sounded redundant, but I couldn't think of a better way to say it. So when I save this component, hello, right? And I go back to my app.js because I hadn't saved this one yet. So now, right, I have this component hello with the prop called name. And so what happens if I save this now, right? I didn't give these last three any props, but what do you think is going to happen? I'm going to save this, and inside of the app, we see that the first component actually renders with hello and my whole name, right? The other three are kind of just seated, are kind of just sitting there without any data to use, right? So not passing a prop doesn't necessarily disrupt whether a component will render or not. There's certain moments, though, where if you are expecting some data to be used in your component and the prop's not there, it might cause some issues. And we'll see that a little bit later when we work with arrays. But just passing that prop is great because, as you can see, the prop is unique to the component that is being rendered. So even though we have 4 of the same components being rendered here, I can have each component essentially have its own data to use when it's being rendered. And that is one of the unique things about props, is each component being rendered can have its own prop. So I can give this hello component a different prop. And I'll say, let's throw some names out here, you know what I'm saying? Right. Save this and then go ahead, right? And now each of those components are rendering with their own bit of data, which is dope, because if you look back at the component, the hello component, I didn't have to do anything but just say, hey, you're going to have some data that is going to be passed in that's called name. And I just want you to use that data in this H3. So remember, when we want to use JavaScript inside of a JSX expression like this, we need to wrap it in curly braces, right? So I just think it's good practice to remember JavaScript, React, curly brace. I'm putting curly brace somewhere to use the data or even pass the data like we did for the props here, right? So passing props is dope when you know you want to create one component that will be extendable with the data that you're passing it. And so much like I was talking about before, though, you can pass a number of props into a component, right? So right now I have this prop called name, right? But let's say I want to show you, for example, like multiple props. So maybe I go ahead and do something like first name and then just go ahead and rename the props like this, right? So now I have this component having completely different props than these other ones, right? So what's going to happen when I save this? Well, again, nothing is going to break per se, except for the fact that, well, if we look at our hello component, that was expecting a prop called name, right? So since this component didn't have any prop called name, it doesn't necessarily render as you might expect. It doesn't have anything there, right? So a component will render even if you don't have the prop that it is looking to have. What might make this component break is if, for instance, that data was expected to perform another function or something, right? Something more complicated, right? We were calling a method on this, and that if that thing didn't exist, we can't call the method. So now the console will get mad at us, and we'll see that again, like I said, when we start working with arrays. For right now, though, right? If I wanted to get this component to work the way I would expect it to, I could do one of two things. Either I could give this component a prop called name, right? And just say, okay, maybe this is the full name, something like this, right? And now, because this component does have a prop called name, it'll still render it up there, right? Other thing I could do is extend this component to make use of those other props in different ways. And there's a couple different ways I could do this just as an example, right? So maybe I add another H4 in here and just kind of say, maybe like something like first name, that'd be props dot first name. Whoops. And I could do something similar for last name. Right. But again, if these components don't have that data, right? So most of these don't have a first name, last name, right? That won't actually show up. So for the people who pass that data, we can see that it's clearly there. But for those that don't, it's still rendering without that information. So it's important to know when you're using props, right? You have to ask yourself, what data is the component expecting to have? And then you have to make sure that you name or give the component those props. Otherwise, it's not going to render the way you expect it to. Props I see in the comment, somebody's talking about, so props is similar to a parameter. Yeah, it's very much similar to a parameter. If you were thinking about it like a function, right? Like if we do consider this like a function, right? Like it is, props are a parameter to that function that it gets access to, and we can make use of the data that was passed into it from the component itself, like so. Michael, go ahead, fam.
All right, so yeah, I'm just trying to like figure out, you know what I'm saying, what's going on under the hood. I think maybe, correct me if I'm wrong, so it was like, so JSX has like an object associated with each thing that it renders. And so is props like a property of each one of those objects?
Yeah, you could think about it like that. I think that's a good way to think about it.
Because they both have like name, for instance, right? So I'm just wondering like how it would figure out whose name they should use. You know what I mean?
Right.
So do they like make a key or like, I don't know. Sorry.
Each component has that object of data passed into it for it to reference. And so whenever a component is getting rendered, even if you're rendering the same component, each render is unique, right? Each render is unique to that particular component in the tree, right? And each component has access to its own props, right? So so it's almost like an instance, like if you think about it like object oriented, right? We would be creating instances of this class, for lack of better words, right? And that instance has its own set of data when it gets created.
Aha. All right. Yes, I get it now. Thank you.
No problem. Cool, yo. So if I want to make this a little bit more, I hope you guys get the point, right? Like we can pass whatever we want as the name of the prop and the data into the JSX. And so long as this receiving component is built to take in that data with props, we can make that very much easily achievable. So if, for instance, I do want to make this a little bit more sophisticated, I might want to, there's a couple things I could do. I could give each of these folks a first name, last name, right? So like if I did that, first name. Right. Right. But as you can see, just typing, I was like, dang, that's a lot of typing. I don't know if I want to do it like this, right? So one thing I can do though is to just make my life a little bit easier is pass this data in a different way to the component as props. So maybe instead of passing just 3 strings, right? Let's say, for instance, I have a piece of data that represents this. Maybe there's some data that represents the students, right? And so students, maybe this is there's a couple ways I can represent this, right? Maybe this is maybe each student, right? Like, let's start there. Maybe each student is an object, right? That has a first name and a last name, right? Something like this. So for instance, if I were representing myself, so if I say like Cam, I would have my first name be Cam and then my last name be Flowers, right? So this is, again, a JavaScript object, key value pairs that get passed to some variable, right? And in this case, right, clearly this object is representing my name with the first name and the last name. So if I wanted to see my name, right, I could do something like Cam dot first name, right? And that will keep my, that will return this, right? Same thing with last name, right? It would return this in as data. So I could theoretically represent that group of students as almost like an array of these objects, right? So if I were to do this, well, just to kind of, before I go ahead and add all of them to an array, just to show you how this might work in props, right? If I know I have, let's just call this data for now. Let's say I have this data that represents me as a student, but the data is an object versus just a string, right? So now, right, if I say, okay, hello, the component, maybe I say, maybe this component is going to receive some data as a prop, and the data is going to be, well, now I got a naming, and I got a naming thing, right? Maybe I say maybe I do it, still call it name, right? But I pass it the data as the object of data here. So the name is represented more as this object instead of just a string. Now, this is going to be interesting, right? Because here I'm passing the data as an object, but here I'm passing it just as a string. So I'm just curious, take a look. If I save this, will this break our thing? And sure enough, it does, right? If we look at the console and take a look here, we see that or actually, if I go back here real quick to make sure. So clearly now there's like some issues between this component rendering the data as an object and it rendering these ones as a string. Suddenly now it doesn't work anymore. So there's no real error per se that shows up that tells us something went wrong, but clearly our component's not rendering anymore. So again, sometimes with JavaScript, things messing up with React, you might not see any errors particularly, but you know, it's up to us to kind of make sure that we're doing something plausible with the data here. I think the issue, right, is that it is assuming, well, if name is going to be an object, I'm going to look for it as an object. But if it's not an object, then I'm not sure how to proceed, right? So let's just go ahead and for now, I'm going to just get rid of these, just kind of comment these out real quick. And let's just work with this one, this first one. So let's say the name is the data. And now, when this component is rendering, right, we want it to render so that it shows that data here, right? So that data, right, is called data because we named the prop data there, right? Or no, we named the name, my bad. So we named the name as a prop. And so in order to access some of the data in there, I need to use the dot, right? So maybe I'll say first name, and let's see if this brings us back to a point of having something there. So cool. So now we're actually referencing some of the data from that object. So props.name is referring to this, and that data is this object that has first name and last name, right? So sometimes you're passing a little bit more sophisticated data. It's not necessarily just a string or anything. It might be an object like this, right? So we're using the dot syntax to access all the data there, right? If I wanted the last name, it would look something like this, right? And clearly we're passing this information in now. Sometimes you see people do thing called destructuring of the object. So let's say they know that props.name is an object. You can grab the variables, right? We could do something like let first name equal props.name dot first name, right? And then let last name equal props.name dot last name, right? And then here, instead of referencing props.name dot all over again, I could just do something like first name because I have it saved as a variable here now, right? And that should also work and show my name here. So playing with the data is really, you can be flexible with it. But now let's say we go back to what we were talking about before. And now let's say we have all those students represented as objects. So clearly, if I want to have this component render both the first name and the last name, I could just add this here also, like last name, with a nice little space in between so that it shows. So technically, let's see if it shows my name with my last name. Okay, cool. And the unique thing now is that with each student, right, we can have each student represented similarly with some data, right? So maybe this, instead of this, I say student 1, right? And maybe I have student 2, and I can give them a name. So I could maybe make this a little easier for myself. I put another student 3. I put one more. Right. So now I have 4 students, right? I could theoretically, right, pass each of these, I could pass each of these individually to each of the students, right? So if I uncomment this and go back to this, right? So now maybe because name now for me is student 1, so I could pass the student 1 object. Oops, same thing here, student 2. Student 3. Student 4, right? And as I'm doing this, right, the name prop doesn't even really make as much sense anymore, right? So maybe I want to say, okay, I don't really want to call this name. I could just say, oh, well, I'm changing it to student now, right? Just because it makes more sense readability wise, probably, right? And all I got to do now is to go back and make sure I just change that here where I'm referencing the prop, right? So instead of props.name.firstname, maybe it's now props.student and props.student, right? So the props are really flexible, right? You give it the name, you reference that name in the component that you're receiving the props in, right? And so long as you reference the prop correctly, you should still be able to use it and there shouldn't be any problem. So I'll just make these saves real quick now that we have all of those students with data. And sure enough, we have all those students showing up with their first name and their last name, right? Hopefully it's not more confusing than just me trying to show you how flexible the props can be, right? We can name it whatever we want to name it. We can pass whatever type of data we want to pass. We just have to make sure that the receiving component can access that data appropriately and that we don't trick the compiler into thinking one type of data is coming in this component, but it's a different type in that component, right? Which again is another reason why folks have been very excited about using languages like TypeScript for JavaScript to make it so that some of those bugs that happened with switching the data type don't occur without us at least getting some errors that help us see what might be going wrong there. Go ahead, Michael, one more time.
Oh, all right, yeah. Don't worry, I'm gonna try to be less of a pain in the ass for the rest of the lecture. But okay. So now you got me curious here, because if we don't know what's in an object, can we use reflection to enumerate it, even if we don't know what these properties are? Like I was thinking something like, we could set up like a loop and use like array notation and then just boom. Will that work? Or like, is there a special way to do that? Or is that beyond the scope of the lecture? Should I just ask you in the class? I mean,
no, that is a good question. So you're saying like, if this was an object, how can we look to see what properties are in there, right? And
yeah, we might not know.
Yeah, the answer is like, you can test to see if that object exists, right? And so what we'll do in a second, I'll add some conditionals in here just because we haven't actually talked about conditionals. So it'll actually be helpful, I think, to see how we might be able to do that, right? is look to see if a particular thing exists, right? So let's do that real quick, right? So let's say, like, to Michael's question, like, how would we kind of know what exists, right? Well, the thing is, like, just like with any kind of programming language, JavaScript also has conditionals inside, right? So we can test to see, right? You know, like if student one dot first name exists, right? And if it exists, it will come back with some data. If not, it will be equal to null, right? And so if I say something like if student one dot first name, that's the same as saying if student one dot first name bang equals null, right? And if that's the case, right, I can have some data to represent that here, right? Otherwise, I'll know, hey, there's actually no data there, right? So similarly, like within the prop, when we're using this data here, right, I can check to see if, if first name exists, right? And if it exists, maybe I want to do something special. Otherwise, right, I might want to do something else, right? So maybe I do something like if first name and last name, like if this is null, if this isn't null and this isn't null, maybe then I want to return what we had before, right? Otherwise, I'm just gonna say maybe return something like an H3 that says something like, I need a name. Right, so what we're doing here now is adding some conditional logic into our component while it's rendering. And we can do this with React, just like we can with any JavaScript, right? Is use conditionals to make some type of statement that says, hey, in this case, do this, otherwise do this, right? So if I save this now and I go back to a component and maybe I don't give it, maybe I don't give myself a last name, and maybe I don't give this one a first name, right? And I save that. Well, now it's just saying, hey, I need a name, right? Like for those two, because they don't, that data actually doesn't exist, right? So we can use some of those conditionals, which we'll talk a lot more about probably in our next session, to do what we call conditional rendering, and to basically say, hey, in one case, I want to render this, but if in another case, I want to render something else. So to your question, Michael, that is totally possible. You just need to make use of some more JavaScript to check whether the data exists and to decide what you want to do in those cases, and what you might not want to do in those cases as well. So just real quick, just to kind of pause and just make sure that folks are still rocking with me. If what I'm talking about only with this concept of props is making sense to you, just give me a thumbs up. Whoops, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong thing, right? If the idea of prop passing some data into the component makes sense, that'd be great to see. And I will just basically just reiterate, essentially, we can pass any data into a component. We got to give it a name and pass some data to it. And then we can reference that data inside of the component by calling props. And so props are essentially a parameter that we pass into our functions so that we can reference the data that is inside of those functions. So if I had a new component, in here and I maybe message.js, right? Right, new component. So first thing I want to do is create a new component. So I'm just going to say const message equals nice little function. Remember, all components are meant to return something. So in this case, right, maybe this component is just a message and it just says written by, and now, right, I might want to tell it who wrote this, right? So maybe I have some props in here, and the prop, maybe props.author or something, right? And because React is declarative, right, I can make this component just like this off nothing, right? I just off rip, right? I have to export it to use it. But now this component is logically written. All it needs is this prop to exist for it to be written correctly, right? So if I go back to the app, and this is just to show you kind of from the beginning, like if I had a new component, how would the prop work, right? So I want to import that component so that I can use it inside of this, in this part of my application, right? And then I just want to return it. So here, maybe I have a message, right? And again, the message is expecting some data called author. So here I could say, hey, the author equals, right? And now, when it renders, right, there you go, that component has access to that data. So that's what props are in a short sense, right? So if that makes sense, give me a thumbs up, because that's really all, that's as simple as it can be, right? I think is pass whatever data you want into the prop, into the component, and you can have that component have that data to use inside of itself. There you go. Seeing a lot more thumbs now. I appreciate that. Don't want to leave y'all hanging. Don't worry. I know we were getting a little confused earlier, but yeah, that's as simple as it can be, right? With props. If I have another message and it's written by somebody else, right, I just give that a different author, right? And I say that author is Naomi, right? And save that, right? And so each component with its props has access to its own data. That's really it. So let's get back to some kind of semblance of an application that makes sense for us, right? So we have these two components now. We have this hello component and we have this message component. I think just to make it easier for us all to make sense of, I'm just going to go ahead and just work with the messages, right? So that things don't get too complicated too quick. So I want people to understand what we're talking about here. So for now, we'll get back to this idea of the objects right in a second. But for now, I'm just going to clean up the app.js and let's just go forward with this idea of messages. Because I think this actually might be a little, oh, go ahead.
Professor, sorry, I got a question.
Go ahead, fam.
So for the author part that you did with the objects, how do you know what author? Does it go to Cam or Naomi, or does it go by line by line?
Each component has its own prop with that data. So each component, whenever it gets created, will know what is passed into this data because each component has its own prop. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So for every author, it'll print out everything. So
for every message, right, it will have its own author, so long as we pass it like this.
Gotcha.
No problem, bro. So let's say we have these messages, right? So I got one for here, let's make another one. And let's say this one is, this author is John, right? So now we got like 3 messages, right? Each message has an author, right? But each message also might have some content, right? So maybe the content is another object, right? Or another bit of data, let's say. It's just another string. And that content for me, maybe you just like, this is a message. And then maybe somebody else responds and they're like, stop whispering, bro. Clearly, I'm having a whole conversation with myself mentally as I write this. And I say, like, right? So we got a little message thread going on. Each message has an author and some content, right? If I save this, well, nothing's going to change here except for the fact that we rendered this new one because, hey, well, we're not ever calling that content inside of our message component, right? So in this component, we just say, hey, written by so-and-so. But if this was a message thread, you would expect to see maybe like the message and the author, right? So in order to do that, let's just change this component up a little bit. Again, because it's going to have multiple elements inside of it, right? Let's say I want a paragraph to represent the data, right? Well, because I have 2 elements and there's nothing kind of wrapping them, I have to give it that that parent element, like I was talking about before. So again, like I told you, I like to wrap my stuff with divs just because that's just how I do it. And so by wrapping this in a div, clearly this gets rid of that error. So now I can say, hey, each message is gonna have, who wrote it, and it's gonna have the text. Matter of fact, I think it would probably be better to put the text first and then written by, right? So here in this paragraph, right, I want to access some JavaScript. I want to access, not only do I want to access some JavaScript, I want to access the props. So the prop I'm looking to access is called content, right? I named it content. I could have named this whatever, but I named it content. So I want to access that data, but it is JavaScript that I want to access so I can pass it into this paragraph, right? So because I want to pass this data into the JSX, right? It would be different if before I'm talking about JSX, I want to look at the content, right? In that case, I don't necessarily need curly braces to do anything, but because I'm dealing with the visual stuff, because I want to show this data, I need some curly braces here inside to say, hey, this is going to be props.content, right? So now this paragraph is going to render this JavaScript expression with the data and with the author, right? So saving this now, right? Now each of these messages should get extended a little bit with the content and then who wrote it, right? I don't like how this is styled right now because of the kind of hierarchy. So I'm just gonna switch this. So let's just make these the H3, and then let's make this the paragraph so that it's a little, so that the hierarchy of the text is a little bit easier to read, right? So nice little message thread. Thumbs up if you're following me and this makes sense, right? We just created a nice little message thread by creating a new component called messages, called message, and then just each message has content and an author, right? Each message, we passed in the author and we passed in the content, but because in the app.js, I'm rendering 3 of them, that's what's giving us this nice little message thread looking scenario here, right? So if that makes sense to y'all, right, then that's great. Like we have the ability to create components and pass the data to them. And that's dope because as you can see, we can extend that, we can extend those components by passing unique data to each one, and then that component can render that unique data itself, right? So to go back to some of what I was talking about before, right? If this was a message thread, of course, I can reference all of these data points separately, right? But maybe I want to have this data a little bit more condensed and consolidated, right? So again, let's say instead of a message, just kind of these loose kind of data points here, what if I have each message represent all of that data as an object, right? So in this case, maybe I have, right, each message, right, message 1 or something, and then say message 1, right? And it has an author, right? And it has some content. I guess I can copy this here, right? Right? So now each message has both data points, an author and content. So again, if I were to look at message 1.author, that would return my name, that would return Cam, right? Or if I looked at message 1.content, right, that would return this bit of data that is the message itself, right? So if I were to give each message, right, if I were to give each message a prop called data, I might want to pass, that message as data to the prop, to the component, right? And then in the component, it can make use of the same kind of context, but instead of it being called, instead of it being just referenced like this, it might be referenced more like this, right? Each message has some data, and that data has content. That data has the author, right? So we're just destructuring the the way the data is written, right? In order to have those messages make sense. So right now I have this structured like an object. To get to what I wanted to show you before, right? Sometimes the data, when you're working with data, especially data coming from different places, right? It might not be just individually packaged. It might not be like, hey, here's author and content author, right? It might be like either an object with all that data, and you have to look for the data inside of the object. Or in certain cases, it might be like an array of objects because, hey, maybe we hit some API that gives us back a list of messages, right? And the list of messages might contain each message, right? Each message might be stored as data inside of it. So to show you that, right? Each message might have a corresponding piece of data inside of it like this, right? So one thing that is kind of annoying, but is true to JavaScript, because that's just how JavaScript works, is you can create strings with either single quotes or double quotes. I think most of y'all know that, but it just kind of gets annoying sometimes. But so yeah, anyway, for this object, right? I have the author, I want to get the content. So I just grab this here. And then the last one would be kind of this. So I'll just copy this. Right? So now I have one array called messages, and there's 3 messages inside of them, right? In this component right now, right? This is a message component, and it's expecting, right? Each message will have an author and some content, right? So I got rid of the first 2, but I'm gonna save the last one with John so y'all can see, right? It's expecting that we're gonna have the content and the author so that it can render appropriately here. Each message has a content and an author, right? The thing that is interesting, the thing that's interesting, right? I didn't actually name this data or anything like that yet. I didn't save this. But yeah, each message is expecting content and an author, which is why this one works, right? It has props.author, props.content. So it will work the way we expect it to. But like I said, we might be working with different types of data. It might not just be like, hey, you're dealing with just a string. You might be dealing with objects, or you might be dealing with arrays of objects, right? And so it's helpful to kind of see how this might change how you work with your components and how props might be changed when you're working with a more sophisticated data collection. So we saw that we could create a message. So long as the message has content and an author, it will be good, right? We can create the component that way. But what do we do here where we have this dope list of messages, right? And maybe this message is continuously adding to it, right? Maybe we got this back from a database or something. So it came back as an array with all of these objects or whatnot, right? How might we represent our component to render now, where instead of it just being kind of single messages, we have this big list of messages? Well, truthfully, there's a couple things we could do, right? Well, each array element could be indexed, right? We could say, hey, maybe messages bracket 0 is going to refer to this first element, right? And then if I set that to some, maybe I say like let data equal messages 0, and then I got data dot author or data dot content, right? Technically, I could do that, right? Where each of these are kind of points of data coming back from the fact that I got a reference to this first element of the array, right? Well, the thing is, what if this array has like 1,000 elements, right? I don't want to reference all 1,000 of elements and then create a message component with 1,000 elements, right? I want to figure out more ways to use the fact that this is an array to work with the data inside of it a little bit more in a more sophisticated way, right? In a more scalable way. So I'm going to show you some stuff that is possible to do with arrays in JavaScript, and hopefully that will help us see some of what we can do to make this component in the app.js a little bit more flexible to kind of be like more like a WhatsApp, right? So all of our messages, no matter what messages are in the array, in an easier way for us than copying this 1,000 times and changing the author and changing the content. Because in that case, then we haven't really gotten away from the point of what the component is supposed to help us do. The component is supposed to make it so that we can reuse that code easily. So let's talk a little bit real quick about arrays in JavaScript. So just give me a thumbs up if you've ever worked with an array, ever, in any language. So I just want to make sure everybody knows what an array is, period, right? Period, put that on everything. Put that on your mamas. Yes, on mamas. All right, a couple of folks haven't put their thumbs up, so I'm assuming that y'all might not have seen an array before. So basically an array is a data collection, right? Normally we've worked with data in essentially single values, right? So we have strings. A string represents one bit of text. Characters, one character, right? Booleans, one true or false value, right? And sometimes though, we want to maybe work with a list of those values, a list of names, a list of strings, a list of Booleans, right? Arrays are the data collection that you can use in order to store a list of data. What is interesting about arrays in most languages is that, you create an array of, you can create an array and that array would have data inside of the, it would have a list of data, right? So typically, if we were in any other language than JavaScript, right? We would have like some array like names, and it would be an array, and then we say this is an array of strings, and it's gonna be Cam and like Kwame, you know what I'm saying? Like Muriel, right? This would be an array. And again, because of JavaScript's the fact that JavaScript isn't a strongly typed language, you don't see us do anything that names this array like, hey, this is an array of strings or something, right? We don't do that in JavaScript. So what is tricky about this is JavaScript arrays, you can actually pass different types of data into the array. It's literally crazy. JavaScript is a crazy language because you could do something like this, right? And technically this would still process as an array. So because of that, right, it's just important to note that JavaScript arrays can pass any type of data inside of them, right? It just comes with the territory of working with a language that's not strongly typed. What that does mean is, like we talked about with Michael's question, we want to just check what the values are when we're working with arrays. But beyond the fact that JavaScript makes arrays kind of crazy in that sense, one thing it does that makes it really dope is it creates a series of methods that we can use to work with arrays. So don't got strongly typed arrays, so you got to check what your values are sometimes to make sure your program's working right. But you got all these dope array methods, so you choose your poison. You know what I'm saying? Like, I personally still like JavaScript, despite the fact that it'd be acting like bugged out a lot of times. But arrays in JavaScript are like any other array that they start with index 0, right? And you can access the length of them with the length property, etc. But one of the things that makes JavaScript arrays different is that it comes with pre-built methods inside of them to make your life a little bit easier when you're working to do functions on the array, right? So for instance, you can see on the left-hand side here are a bunch of the different methods. You can just look at the last line, the last statement to see what those methods are called. So here's a good one, right? Find is an element inside, is a method in JavaScript arrays that allow us to find the first element that satisfies the condition or the testing condition, right? So if we look at an example, let's say we have an array of numbers. I could use the find method to find the first element where that element is greater than 10, right? And that is all pre-built into JavaScript, right? I don't got to do some crazy method to look and then compare or whatnot, right? Those are kind of built in, right? Similarly, filter is another method that we kind of use pretty often with arrays, right? Which allows for you to basically trim an array based on some other, like another condition, right? So here, if I have this array of words, I could use the filter method to basically say for each word, I want to return the array where the word is, the length is greater than 6. And again, the array method will run and run this function on the array elements. And so long as this returns true, it will add it to an array that then you can see as the output of this function here. So array methods are meant to make your life a lot easier in JavaScript, right? The thing that they do that allows us to do that is, as you can see, they pass functions into them to allow for you to pass a function that will run on every element of the array. So things like find and filter run by passing a method that essentially gets called on every item of the array and then returns the array where after that function has been executed. This comes in handy for something like maybe y'all have been used to, right? Writing for each methods for your array. So, you know, sometimes you want to run a for loop on an array and do something every time for that element, right? So in JavaScript, we use the for each method to run, basically iterate through the array. And what this does again is it passes in a function and allows for you to reference the each element of the function, each element of the array as a variable that then you can run some other function on, right? So we'll take a look at this in a second when I write one from scratch. So let's say for this messages, right? We have this array and it has 3 messages inside of it. Just to show you some basic JavaScript before we even get into what we see visibly, let's say I want to do kind of some array methods on this array, right? So I could say something like messages dot, because it's an array, right? I get access to all of these methods. So maybe I want to do the for each, and for each is a function, right? But what they don't show you here in a very easy to see way is that each, you pass another function into this array method. So for each itself is a function. So I'll put the parentheses here. But for each, basically, if we look at it VS Code, right, it takes in a callback function. So for each element, what function do we want to run for each element? So for each element, right, I'm going to create an arrow function that basically is just, this itself is just is saying, hey, I'm creating a new function. Remember I said like the arrow syntax for functions would be like, if we have function 1, right, this would be what it would look like as an arrow function. So here we're just creating a function, right? This is literally this part of that function, but there's just no name, right? We didn't name it anything. So this is what we call an anonymous function. So we're just passing a function into this one that essentially here we want to do stuff for each item in the array, right? So every time we look, right, like each iteration, I should say, each iteration of the loop, we might want to do something. So for each looks at every element. But what's unique about this is because this function is being is a callback function, we can pass a parameter into this function that will represent each item in the array. So I know this is kind of like one of those things that gets a little complicated or tricky for folks, but let's say, right, this messages is an array, right? This is an array. There's 3 messages inside of this array, right? So if I say message here, right, this is just me saying for each message in the array as this array is iterating, right? Now I can do something with it, like console.log message.content, right? So now I'm saying, hey, take this array and for each element in the array, right, run this function, but I can make use of, I can call essentially this, I can add a property that is going to represent the item of the array that it's going to see in each loop, right? I could name this whatever I want. I could call this M if I could just say M or something random. Whoops. VS Code not making it easy for your boy, right? So I can say m.content, right? But that doesn't really, that's not very clear, right? So if you agree with what I'm saying here, right? This array is an array of messages. So technically I would call each thing in here separated by a comma a message, right? So I'm just calling that here so that this function can be a little bit more readable. So for each message in the messages array, right? For each message in the messages array, console.log that message is content, right? So if I save this, it's actually a great time to talk about this. You might be wondering, well, where's this console log going to show up, right? Like what? Like, okay, we're calling this console log, but where's it going to show up? Well, remember, anytime you're console logging in the front end, it is going to take place in the inspector, right? So if I go back to our React application, open the inspector and pull over the console, right? We'll see a couple of the what are these errors, man? We'll take a look at that in a second. But as you can see, right? Oh, these are some errors from some of the old stuff I was doing before. But as you can see, right, this is console logging those messages from the array, right? So the for each, the way it works is basically in most array methods, the way it works is it takes in this thing called a callback function. And the callback function has two parameters that you can pass into it. One will represent the item or the value of that element in the array, like you can see here, value. And then also you can pass an index number. So let's say I want to also get back the index number, then the method would look something like this, right? So now I have for each, I'm talking about the value here and then the index, right? With the index, right? Every time this array sees another message, the index will change, right? So that's how array methods work in JavaScript, right? We can pass a function we can call these functions on the array and then pass a function in that will run in those particular cases, right? So for each is one array method that we use quite a bit to do something for every element of an array. But one that we use even more often is the map function. So let's just go to take a look at it. For each essentially says, hey, it just executes a function once for every array element, right? For every element in the array, it's going to run some function, right? Map is a little bit interesting because what the map does is it does the same thing as the for each, where it calls a function on every element in the array, but map will return a new array with the results of that function. So essentially map will create a new array altogether that has the values of whatever this function is. So let's say for this array, we have an array of numbers, and then we run a map function on it. That map function is basically going to say, hey, for every element called X that we see in this array, for every element, right, we're going to call each element X. For every element, we're going to do X times 2. So this is going to go through the array and double all of the values, right? And it will return all of those array values in a new array called map1, right? And map1, as you can see, when they console log, just is a new array with all the values inside of it, right? So maps are really helpful because they give you back a new array. And that is a very common JavaScript. In JavaScript, we use these array methods often. At JSX, the map function actually can be really helpful because if you have an array of JSX elements, you can render those elements. In your component in a very sophisticated way. So let's get to the point so you can still talk about. Then we'll go through it, and hopefully it makes more sense in the example sense. So we have this array called messages, right? Give me a thumbs up if you rock with me so far. We got this array called messages. It just is a message. It just is a array of objects. You know what I'm saying? Like nothing crazy, just an array of objects. Each object has the author and the message. Hopefully that makes sense just in and of itself, right? So with this array of objects, I might want to do something like create a message component, right? I want to create a message component with all of these messages. And I know that I can pass props to the message component we already wrote so that it'll show those messages. Right? But what I want to figure out is an easy way to basically, for however many messages I have in this array, show them as a component. So here's what I'll do. I'm gonna do it, and then let's break down what's gonna happen, right? So remember, from when we first were talking about all of this stuff with the components, right? We were talking about how like, hey, these are just functions. So like we could have some functions and call those functions essentially in the component as well, right? So let's say I create a new function, right? So somewhere inside of here, like let's say I create a new function and I'm gonna call it, let's call it render messages, right? And this function, right, is going to be, this function is essentially all I want this to do is return a new message, new message component. So essentially all I want this to do is return, right, a message component like this, right? Just return that JSX for your boy, right? But what we want to do is we want each message to have an author and we want each message to have a content, right? Because then that way that message will actually show up the way we expect it to, right? So technically, right, I want to call this function and just have it return, like, I want it to return a message inside of itself, right? I want all these messages to just get returned this way. Well, the thing that's interesting is that with the fact that we have access to these array methods, right, we can actually make this happen in a more interesting way than you might expect, right? So I want this render messages to take these existing messages and basically turn them into JSX components. Well, turns out I can use the array map function to make that happen in a pretty sophisticated way, right? So the way that the map function would work, right, is instead of calling for each, I could call map, right? And messages.map will say, hey, for every element inside of this messages, what do you want me to do? Well, I just want for every element, right, for every message or every object like this, right, I just want to return, right, a new message component where the author would be, right, remember with props, we got past curly braces like this, right, where the author would be, right, message, my bad, message dot author, right? Because this, right, remember when we map through the array, we're going to look at each element inside of it, and each element is going to have a corresponding name. I could call this value, I could call this whatever, right? The idea is the same though, right? For every value in the array, I'm looking at each object that's inside of this messages array, right? So here I'm saying, hey, map through this big messages array. And for every value, for each value in the array, we're going to do something. What we're going to do is return a new component built with the data inside of each object that is stored in the array. Kind of sophisticated, but kind of crazy cool because we can use this JavaScript to save us a lot of time, right? So now, like I said, messages.map is going to return a new array, right? So technically what this returns is an array of some sort. So if instead of just returning this like this, right, if I return the map, right? So messages.map is itself a mapping function, right? So this function is returning some new components for myself, and I'm returning this function, this entire array. So if you look at if you hover over .map, it says it returns an array that contains the results, right? So all I'm saying here is, okay, cool. I'm going to return this array of technically messages, right? And so now inside of my app.js, I can call that JavaScript function, render messages, to do some work for me, right? So just like anything before, right? I can call a JavaScript expression with curly braces. Turns out in this case, I'm calling an actual function. So what I hope to see happen is, hey, when the app.js renders, right? I want it to render and call this function render messages. Render messages is a function that is essentially running a map, an array map. It's mapping over all of the elements inside of this messages array. And for each message, right, I refer to it as value. I could have called it message, I could have called it data, I could have called it whatever. I'm going to return a new component message with the values data, right, for the author and the content, right? So because I'm returning this array, now what I'm hoping is that render messages will just return that array as JSX, and that we can see that data inside of our component. So let's save it, see if it works. Whoops, close this, go back here, and cool. We're getting back all of our messages now, right? So clearly now we're looking through all of these messages. So if I were to add a new message and just say, Cam, add one content, and say, whoa, this is an array, right? Now that message is still part of the map. So it's still rendering it. And all I had to do was call this render messages function one time, right? So the array makes it so that I can actually map over values and return an array of JSX. And so long as I have the JSX in an, so long as what the array has is JSX, it will render correctly if it has a corresponding kind of parent component wrapping it. So now, right, I don't have to do anything to this message component. The message component itself is just a blueprint for a new component, right? So whenever I want a message, I know, hey, I create a new message by passing it a content and an author. Here, right, before we were just passing a bunch of messages with content and author. But now we're passing an entire function that is going to give us an array of messages with authors and content, right? And by doing this, we can save ourselves a lot of time in having the ability to create content in lists without necessarily having to do so much duplication of code, right? So here, I haven't duplicated anything in the code. I've called this function once. That function was declared up here where I just am returning the value of this map. And if this array of messages suddenly was 1,000 elements or 10,000 elements, 1,000,000 elements, this method would still work. And I don't have to touch anything in the code for it to change that, right? Because the way that it's written is going to look through the big list, no matter how many values there are. And for every item in the list, it's going to call this function. That function takes the value of that particular element and says, hey, for that element, let's return a new component, right? So we're returning a new message component and grabbing the data from within this particular object. So whether the list is 5, whether the list is 1,000,000, this method will still work and be turned into JSX that we can see here. And all we needed to do in order to make this work was pass the prop to the message component, just like we talked about earlier today. So arrays are something that really kind of make your programs a lot more, you can use arrays to make more scalable programs, especially when you're working with lists of data. And if you think about it, a lot of times when we're working with sites, right? The New York Times website has a list of articles. You're seeing a bunch of things on there. Airbnb has a list of properties, right? Instead of having each component listed out for the millions of thousands of things, data points on their sites, right? They can create simple components that represent each item, right? So each component might be, hey, this is my house, right? On Airbnb. And you can use mapping functions in the arrays to create those big lists in a more dynamic way, so that you have the data show no matter what. So arrays are definitely something that if you're interested in working with React, that you want to get familiar with the syntax of and some of those array methods, because they add a lot of value to you when you're working with big lists of data. But other than that, working with props makes it so that you can create these blueprints of your components and pass this data in so that you can have these components also be a lot more flexible, so you don't have to reuse, so that you don't have to duplicate code. You can reuse this code over and over again with all you're swapping is the data points that the code is taking to create these more sophisticated applications that require a lot less code. So that's props. Those are arrays, and a lot more to talk about. And we're definitely going to get into more of it in the next couple of sessions. So don't worry if you don't fully understand it. Just want to show it to you. Appreciate y'all for your time. If you have a question, feel